I'll start. Spectrality, ontology, ghosts, apparitions, otherness, shadows, phantoms, morning, zeitgeist, gaze, night, uncanny. Spectre comes from the Latin spectrum, meaning to look for or to see, or from the French word spectre. The Greek word phantasma is also related, meaning to make visible.
I put these on the prompt as two paintings, one by Goya in the Prado, of a dog which is it sinking into the sand? Is it in quicksand, or is it emerging out of the sand or the mud? And a painting by Philip Guston of just a kettle boiling, bereft of any other figure. So kind of, in both cases, a sort of isolated figure on the ground, extreme version of figure on ground or gestalt reality.
In his book Spectres of Marx, Jacques Derrida employs the phrase from Hamlet, "The time is out of joint," in order to open up the connection between time and spectrality. Derrida evokes a way of learning how to live between life and death, and by living between the two, occupy a place of ghostly singularity that resembles an emission. We could in turn align this idea to an emission with the unconscious, which for Lacan is seen as a form of unmeant knowledge that can't tolerate one's knowing that one knows. The image represents a paradox that suspends the relationship between knowing and seeing, because it corrodes both the legible and the visible within three secured economies. This is way the image incorporates a negative force that in turn cannot be grasped, a veritable vanishing point of knowledge. The non-graspability of the image is the force that sets it aside or at a distance. Time is out of joint, Hamlet. The actor cannot identify himself totally with Hamlet because it is not known who he is. Thus, he must always remain partly himself, but also represent what he is not. This difference opens out the space of the fictional as if. The distinction between the living and the dead has been at the root of thinking about the image. Apparitions. Ian Kay, living in a boat and playing the flute by the willow. Southern Song. Liang Pei, Southern Song.
So this is painting in what's known as splashed in style, where literally they splash ink to begin the painting and make a kind of figure out of the splash. So there's a kind of tension between figure and the accident. The more sparse painting is of the poet, the Tang poet Li Pao, one of the most famous poets of Chinese classical tradition. He was partly alcoholic and used to compose poems when he was inebriated. Sort of ecstatic relationship to the language.
Zheng Rong, Nine Dragons, 13th century.
It's a remarkable scroll. It's a very long hand scroll which is full of just intertwining dragons. Just a fragment.
Gong Pei, Yuan dynasty, 13th to 14th century.
Another long hand scroll. a kind of parade of the dead, as it were, the spirit realm.
C.I. Callum, hands in Central Asia, 15th century.
He's a very remarkable scientist. Sorry. These are Central Asian drawings. They seemingly come out stylistically out of nowhere. There's no precedent for them, and there's no continuation of them. They're just a group of paintings which are in the Topkapi Museum in Turkey, in Istanbul. It's not known what the religion is that goes with them, or what kind of practice it represents. So.
Ezekiel Yoshitoshi, Kiyomori Burns with fever, 1883. Sorry about the pronunciation.
That's a ghost painting, ghost print.
Goya, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, 1797 to 1799.
That's as if it's the alter side of the philosophy of reason, which he obviously had to reassess in light of the French invasion of Spain.
Gary Colt created a whole series of paintings of the insane in the attempt to capture melodies of the soul, or the haunting of the subject cast into the elsewhere.
It's the early 19th century.
The madman sees the daylight, the same daylight as the man of reason. Both live in the same brightness, but seeing the same daylight and nothing but daylight, he sees it as void, as night, as nothing. Foucault.
Michel Foucault.
Gustave Moreau, The Apparition, 1874 to 6. Odilio Riddle, The Black Sun, 1900.
They're both simplest artists.
Paris changes, but in sadness like mine, nothing stirs. New buildings, old neighbourhoods turn to allegory, and memories weigh more than stone. Georges Eugène Haussmann, 1809 to 1891. At Gay, 1857 to 1927, Rue Laplace and Rue La Valette, 1926. In the book Benjamin's Ghosts, the writer Gerhard Richter discusses Benjamin's unfinished books, Arcade's project, which he believes is in many ways a ghost book. The idea that Paris as a city is haunted by ghosts has a history rooted in the 19th century writings of Baudelaire, Hugo, and this passes into 20th century with figures such as Breton. Whether discussing the promise and decay of Paris and the ideological patterns of the 19th century, whether circumscribing the ghostly origins or procedures of photography, this is why old photographs appear ghostly, the haunted nature of technological innovations such as the telephone, street lighting, and railroad travel, or the cultural acronyms of the Baudelaire family and his metropolitan habitats, Benjamin's texts are populated by ghosts and phantoms. Everyone knows from dreams the horror of doors that will not close. More precisely, they are doors that seem locked without being so. In an intensified way, I made the acquaintance of this phenomenon in a dream in which I, accompanied by a friend, encountered a ghost in the window of the first floor of a house to our right. And as we proceeded, it accompanied us through the interior of all houses. It walked through walls, always keeping in line abreast with us. I saw this even though I was blind. The stroll we take through the arcades, Assajon, is basically too much ghostly path. Gespensterweg, in which the doors give way and the walls move. Walter Benjamin, Eugène Attiquet, Passage du Grand Cerf, 145 Rue Saint-Denis, 1999. The modernity of the 20th century can be said to be transformed by what Akira Lippitt describes as three phenomenologies of the inside that were each established in 1895, that is X-rays, cinema, and psychoanalysis. He terms this the haunting of the inside, and this shifts not only the imaging of interiority, but transform the conditions of visuality. They transformed the structure's visual perception, shifting the terms of the vision from phenomenal to phantasmatic registers, from perceived visually to an imagined one, from visual to avisual. It is known that Freud did everything possible to not neglect the experience of haunting, spectrality, phantoms, ghosts. He tried to account for them courageously in as scientific, critical, and positive a fashion as possible. But by doing that, he also tried to conjure them. Like Marx, his scientific positivism was put in the service of his declared hauntedness and of his unavowed fear. The reader, Archive Fever. The Return of the Repressed. In the beginning of his book, Nadja, André Breton asks, "Who am I? If this once I were to relay on a proverb, then perhaps everything would amount to knowing whom I haunt."
That was one of the main surrealist novels, this book Nausea, where he follows a female figure through the streets of Paris, not knowing whether she's a ghost or whether she's real. George Rodchenko.
Collage opening out the realm of the other.
What sense?
1934. Dorothea Tanning, birthday 1942. Man Ray, Marquis Casati, 1922. Man Ray explored the process of photography to its technical limit, exposing in the process the fragile limit between reality and the spectral. Man Ray, Solarization, 1931. Man Ray, Jacqueline, 1930. Imogen Cunningham, Man Ray version, Man Ray, 1961. The Uncanny.
Someone else read now. Who's next?
Okay, I read. Freud's uncanny is an essay that is investigate the realm of darkness, saying the uncanny would always, as it were, be something one does not know one's way about in, yet it is not the pure realm of darkness that is the concern about, rather what is revealed or brought to light. Paul de Man defined the uncanny as to make the invisible visible. Darkness is uncanny because it is a site of ghostly emissions. Freud also evoked the fear of the blindness and the fear of being blurred alive, both of which are other forms of loss that might be figured as being connected to the light. The reed evoked the idea of the relationship of the night, an idea of a difficult writing or research which, by not submitting to the norm of the culture, is excluded from the scene, occulted, deprived of the light of the day.
What do you want of me? This is a very small print, choosing the margins of surrealist movement, but became a sort of big figure in the late 70s and 80s.
Lagarde, Jerry, 19th century.
The 19th century began on 1st of January 1801 and ended on the...
Oh, shut up, Syria. Psychoanalysis has taught that a dead parent, for example, can be more live for us, more powerful, more scary than the living. It is the question of the ghosts, the reed. The man is a death who lives a human life. Alexander Kojève, Picasso self-portrait, 1972.
Just before he died.
Francis Bacon, Death Mask of William Blake.
This painting was in the exhibition of the Bacon paintings at the National Portrait Gallery.
We can't see her saying as experience this as a gap. Perhaps this image comes before us, but also after us, and as such has a doubled relation as image which can be described as haunting. Philip Jones, Griffith, 1971. Victim. Renam. Joseph Beuys, How to Explain a Picture to the Death. Harler. 1975. Sorry about the name. Philip Gunston, Head and Bottle, 1975. Jonathan, the one before, is mask on that man's face.
You got a gold leaf.
Okay, gold leaf. Christine Podensky. Christine Portansky, The Theater of Shadows, 1984. Mourning, the sensation of a dead inside a living body. Sebastião Salgado, Mexico, 1980. The Ghost of the Modern Cinema. The Still, the Ken Dowland, Ghost Dance, 1983. The cinema is the art of the ghosts, the battle of the phantoms.
Yes, this is a still from the film Ugetsu Monogatari, which is by Mizoguchi, the Japanese filmmaker. It's one of the great ghost cinematic art masterpieces. So if you can get a copy of that or see a fragment online, it's really remarkable.
In the film,
we'll skip reading it because it's a bit dense.
Okay. Michelangelo Antonini, Blow Up. It's a Polish film, right? 1966. Spook is a term that is employed for aspire, but to be spoked is also being affected by the spectrum event. In both cases, it is difficult to detect, so it's a form of uncanny or being looked at from the priceless place. Double life. In the film of A Double Life of Veronique by the Kieslowski, the two women born at the same time, seemingly identical, and both live with the sensation of missing someone. Freud thought that is most of instance in which the double are encountered indicates the phenomenon of the uncanny. Falling from the Deleuze developed his discussion of the double in terms of virtual and actual image within the structure of the mirroring, which leads to the coalescence between the two. Not is the image constructed out of the two sides, actual and virtual, but also on the internal level. The self is the through into the division. The double is in alliance with the spirit and phantoms causing differentiation between the animal and inanimal. Freud described how the doubles is related to the mirrors, spirit, and the shadows. The Connie brother, steal from the man who wasn't there. The poetic of
Next reader. Who's next?
I can read. Poetics of Spectrality. Where no gods are, spectres rule. Novalis.
By Jane Romantic.
Memory is not an instrument for exploring the past, but its theatre. It is the medium of past experience, as the ground is the medium in which dead cities lie interred. Walter Benjamin. When we are awake, we go through a dream. We are the ghosts of past time. Kafka. At first sight, the image does not resemble a cadaver, but it could be that the strangeness of a cadaver is also the strangeness of the image. Maurice Blanchot. Time is the substance from which I am made. Time is a river which carries me along, but I am the river. It is a tiger that devours me, but I am the tiger. It is a fire that consumes me, but I am the fire. Georges Louis Borges. Anthony Artaud, haunted by the extreme limit of the outside. Samuel Beckett, Not I, 1972.
Remarkable. It's just a mouth reciting. So all you see on the screen is the mouth. It's a short play.
In the 1993 book, Spectres of Marx, Derrida develops ways in which the persistence or return of elements from the past assert themselves in the manner of a ghost. The spectrality of the ghost, Derrida adds, is what exceeds and thus deconstructs all ontological oppositions, being and nothingness, life and death. It can give and give pardon. Kaz Sagafi, Apparitions of Derrida's Other. Everything remains to be said on the subject of the ghost and the ambiguity of the return, for what renders it intolerable is not so much that it is an announcement of death, nor even the proof that death exists, since this ghost announces and proves nothing more than his return. What is intolerable is that the ghost erases the limit which exists between two states, neither alive nor dead. Passing through, the dead man returns in the manner of the repressed. It is his coming back which makes the ghost what he is, just as it is the return of the repressed that inscribes the repression. In the end, death is never anything more than the disturbance of limits. The impossible is to die. That's Hélène Cixous, Fiction and Its Phantoms, a reading of Freud's Das Unheimliche. Toni Morrison book Beloved explores the story of Seth, who killed her baby called Beloved in order to prevent her from knowing the horrors of slavery. The baby's ghost haunts Seth, and this threatens to consume her. The book was inspired by a story of an enslaved woman named Margaret Garner who committed infanticide. Photography and spectrality. In every photograph there are spectres. What survives or lives on in a photograph, thanks to the photographic process, is the survival of the dead or of ghosts. Kaz Sakafi. Spirit photography was developed in the mid-19th century and became closely associated with the evolution of it as a medium. I show you what you do not see, the body's inner forces. Francesca Woodman, 1958. Untitled in Rome, Italy, 1977-8. Am I in the picture? Am I getting in or out of it? I could be a ghost, an animal, or a dead body, not just this girl standing on the corner. Francesca Woodman, Untitled, Rhode Island, 1976. And again, Francesca Woodman, Angel Series, Rome, Italy, 1977. On the edge of disappearing or fading out, repeating this again and again until disappearing from life itself. On Being an Angel, Self-Portrait, 1977. Every appearance is haunted by disappearance. Every apparition disappears in its coming to appear. Kaz Sakafi. Is this Kaz an artist or
A writer.
A writer, okay. Joel Peter Witkin's photographs present a human afterworld in which photography is inherently occult. The Kiss, 1982. The monstrous. For the monstrous is not simply grotesque, aberrant, or deviant, a strange, misshapen anomaly, but also a prodigious figure, marvellous, beyond belief, excessive, unrestrained, and extraordinary. A figure, the figure, of the impossible that never appears as such. Kasagafi. The screen, this anti-world in the world, produces images without ever referring to some original form without matter. The image maintains only a ghostly reality, completely spiritualized. Jean-Luc Marion, The Crossing of the Visible. And the image is Dado Moriyama's Imitation, 1995. Aiko Hosai, Kazuo Ono. Aiko Hosei Kamatachi, 32, 1968. Aiko Hosei Kazuo Ono.
That's an image of Daruma, who was the origin of Chan and Zen Buddhism.
Ghost mask, no. Hokusai, Japanese ghost, mid-19th century. The School of Hokusai, female ghost in the moonlight, mid-19th century. Yoshiko Ueda Amogatsu, 1994.
That's the lead dancer in the group Sankai Juko, the Buto dancers.
Buto dance performances often portray a space where life appears to touch the realm of the dead, either apparitional or diseased body, as the medium of expression. Yoshiko Ueda, Quino, number 20, 1993. Yoshihiko Ueda, Miles Davis, 1986. Hiroshi Sugimoto, Seascape, Liguria Sea near Saviori, 1993. To me, photography functions as the fossilization of time. Hiroshi Sugimoto, Distorted Universal Vision, Self-Portrait, 2003. Hiroshi Sugimoto's work might be seen as investigating the medium of photography as an ancient level of human memory. Sugimoto makes a connection between the mask and the photograph. A mask doesn't age, but the living face soon fades away like the portrait of Dorian Gray and finally dies, leaving only the mask behind. Like cicada shells once, the insect has broken out of its subterranean nether life and winged away. Photographs preserve the husk of human souls now flown off to that boundless freedom, such is death. In no drama, many different forms of time coexist, and the mask serves as devices for transporting the performer through these different levels of time within the same space. The structure of the drama is divided in two separate parts, the first in which the character enacts the scene, and in the second wearing the mask of the ghost's former self. Sugimoto says that the ghost may be said to be manifesting in double, both as the ghost and as the incarnation of who the ghost was when alive. In all of his various series of photographs, we have this strange doubling and layering of time and levels of reality. Since 1997, Sugimoto photographed famous modern buildings, but rather than being documents of presence, they instead come towards us as out-of-focus visions seemingly existing in a place between here and nowhere. I'm trying to recreate the imaginative visions of the architecture before the architect built the building, so I can trace back the original vision from the finished product. All the details and all the mistakes disappear. There is a lot of shadows melting. Before and after history. Hiroshi Sugimoto. Daniel Gustav Kramer, Woodland, 2004. But why should forests haunt the mind like some mystical dream or nightmare that every now and then spreads its long prehistorical shadows over the ordinary clarity of things modern? On the basis of what data of prehistory, to borrow a phrase from Walter Benjamin, does the forest become dense with associations and monstrous fears? The forest is at once a temple of living pillars and a scene of horror, an enchanted wood or a wood of abandon. Robert Harrison. The forest stands in its indifference to the gaze and as such basks in its own impenetrability. It is as a surface, a covering, but also a void without defined edge. It gives itself over to the apparitional. It is a place to be stalked by the other, or a place to assume disguises. As a flux, it stretches and moves, becoming a form that is in some way also elsewhere from it. We might think of the forest as a realm given over to modes of darkness. It offers promise in pathways and openings, splendor in the shafts of light that penetrate downward. The soft of the underneath might comfort, and yet we are in the grip of its encroaching strangulation of passage. Vision is secured by it, and in this we conceive an imagined third figure or even a force. In such a space we might imagine ways in which sound begins to connect with vision, and in doing so creating an oscillation of the perceptual field. Akiko Takizawa, Shadows on the Hill. The idea that imagination represents a wavering between the finite and the infinite is rooted in the writing of Schelling, and this implies that wavering is an essential feature of identity itself. This construct of a wavering imagination can be used in part to examine the photographic work of Akiko Takizawa, because it presents the figures that capture a motion between not only between the real and the spectral, but also between being and subtraction, non-being. It would be an obvious form of recognition to say that these images are invariably touched or even saturated by darkness, and from there talk of a shadow or even spectral aesthetics, all of which would indicate a withdrawal from the concerns of the day. Akiko Takizawa, Fatherfield 2, 2005. Philip Loca di Corsa, Iolanda from East of Eden, 2011. Does someone else want to take over?
Yeah, I can. The ghost is distinguished by its gaze. It sees without being seen, which Derrida calls spectral asymmetry. Pollock, in the words of Harold Rosenberg, became a ghost inhabiting the art world. Warhol, Self-Portrait, 1986. Giuseppe Pennone, Reverse Your Eyes, 1970. Douglas Gordon, Hollywood Blind Series, White Blind Janet, 2002. Gerhard Richter, Betty, 1977. George Shaw, Scenes from the Passion, Home Time, 1999. George Shaw, The Living and the Dead, 2015 to 16. Leon Zhang, Butterfly Dream, 2012. Leon Zhang, Overlooked, 2013. Indigo, The Ghost Has No Home, 2013. Rose Zhu, Hold, Tear, 2019. In Hold, Tear, 2019, a figure is cast double. The tonal poetics derive from the night that never quite arrives. The space between the two is measured to the point of aloof distance, but then they are not apart because they appear as being the self-same. Is this double an outcome of spectrality? Hands held behind the back, faces turned away, light touching the nerve of withdrawal point towards a deeper mode of displaced presence. It is a dark painting both on the level of tone and mood, but a painting issuing out of compelling lightness of touch, a fold of tone and touch. This is what we are given over to, the art of tone and touch, evading common sense. Evasive, it simply goes on. Rose Zhu, Still Life Number 2, 2018. Mark Leckey, Dream English Kid, 1964 to 1999, 2015. From one moment to the next, we find ourselves sensibly and physically outside ourselves, outside the blind slipping away of our little stretch of time. We see the night that borders our time, and we touch on some aspect of it. Not the future, but the coming of something or someone. The coming of something that is already of us and the world, but that has to come from somewhere else, displaced elsewhere into an unimaginable elsewhere.
These are
references.
No Journey into the Night.
You touched on quite a lot of Japanese ghost stories. I'm wondering, because we have such a great cultural mix on our group here, if anyone wants to volunteer more ideas about Chinese ghost stories or Korean ghost stories, or because I think, I don't know, sometimes I feel like the ghost stories of the Asian cultures are much richer than those of the Western, but I might be wrong.
That's interesting you mentioned, because when I saw those prints on the Japanese ghost thing, I was just thinking about, have I seen anything like that in traditional Korean old paintings or stories, folklores, etc. You know, at ICA I was exposed to a lot of witch stories, for example, that Russian witch with a chicken feet, lives on that sort of thing.
Oh, isn't it
Uh,
Dragon who lives in a house on chicken feet? That's
that sort of thing, you know, or like German stories, it's European stories of witches and ghosts, that sort of thing. And I just realized, funny enough, in Korea, as far as I'm aware, we have a lot more of stories with, say, tiger, with the children or tigers and mothers raising children, that sort of folklore, but not so much ghost. Not that I remember. I think it's maybe cultural thing of, you know, cultural codes are so different in each countries. I was thinking about Italy, Spain, Portugal. Do they have folklore related to ghost compared to, say, German, Norway, or Scandinavian countries, or Russia? When it comes to Asia, I think Japanese, Korean, Chinese all have a very different style of folklore. And then you move to, of course, US, which is very new anyway, but then maybe Native Americans, they might have ghost stories. So going back to Sharon's question, not so much so in Korea. That was the answer that I can think of for now. But I always like to think about, you know, different part of world and how they connect or disconnect. So someone else, please.
Yeah, in India, like their ghosts are very, very like they are entwined in their daily life, kind of a thing. And stories I've always heard. I'm a mom, and like, you know, forever. And otherwise, also there's a big story, like it's a series of stories called Vikram and Betal, where the king is like this ghost or this soul or whatever you can call it, sticks on his back, and the whole it's all moral stories basically, but fun kind of a thing. But it's like very known. But otherwise, also there are like many ghost stories. But this is what the children like, children's stories from this series. It's very famous, Vikram and Betal. Yeah.
I'd like to add one more thing. When I was young, I read a lot, and there are this particular series of books, like children's stories around the world, that I not just remember. Since you mentioned about Indian thing, I also remember reading quite a few African stories, children's stories involve lots of animals, like a crocodile. Crocodile in Africa? Somehow I remember whatever river with the crocodile thing. And going back to Korea, we do have a lot of children's stories involved an animal like a fox or tiger sort of thing, not so much of ghost.
I think from my understanding, actually, there's a different aspects. If in the aspects of entertainment, always the ghost, there's one is like a psychological horror, and another side is something like the ghosts. Maybe they create the narrative or a mystery about the mystery story about the ghosts, perhaps in love with the human. So this is and this is quite popular in my country, actually.
It's interesting how the ghosts emerges as a philosophical figure, particularly strong in German Romanticism, Jaina Romanticism, where you get the themes of the night, which is very dominant. The ghost is related to the night as a figure. And also to allegory, I think. The idea of the double.
Also, just remember, don't they have something like a headless man on the horse in the Halloween street in the state? Something like that.
In your presentation, Jonathan, which I thought was really, so wonderful. At one point you mentioned ghost printers, or ghost printmakers, I can't remember, and ghost painters. And I was thinking about ghost writers. And as a sort of profession, I mean, in recent years, a ghost writer is a professional writer who will write a autobiography, if that isn't too much of a paradox, or contradiction rather, will write an autobiography for somebody else. So famously in the last few years, Prince Harry's ghostwriter was quite prominent in the media. But thinking about the poem Ozymandias that I mentioned last week, and Percy Shelley's poems, and the critical study of the extent to which his wife, Mary Shelley, an extremely brilliant writer in her own right, was influencing his writing, was potentially writing his writing, correcting it, making adjustments, inspiring, maybe even writing whole poems. There's something kind of interesting about that idea that someone was kind of a ghost in their own day and is a sort of double ghost in Mary Shelley's case, almost 200 years later. And then in terms of what you were just saying about the sort of relationship between, the philosophical relationship between the ghost and the night, and to kind of fuse the kind of ethics of what I was just talking about with a kind of a grander, or not a grander, but a larger notion of kind of a suppressed, a repressed, maybe a kind of a psychological other that sort of infuses a writing as a ghostly dark presence. There's also interesting contemporary critical writing about the American mid to late 19th century poet Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote these pretty singular Gothic, often featuring ghosts, often featuring a narrator and a protagonist, and you're not entirely sure whether the protagonist is insane and imagining what's going on, or whether there is actually a ghost which is tormenting the protagonist. But the interesting commentary is that Edgar Allan Poe was writing during the American Civil War, and he was briefly served in that Civil War himself, but also was writing as someone who came from the South during a period of slavery. And some people kind of argue that the kind of ghostly presence, which kind of slowly turns his characters insane is the sort of repressed horror of a kind of recognition of the national injustice of slavery within the United States, and how this kind of repressed recognition of one's own crimes kind of conjures up these apparitions that sort of torment an individual or a society. So there's a kind of ghostly presence which is never explicitly mentioned in Poe's poetry, that some people think expresses the voices of people whose voices were suppressed materially at the time.
It's really interesting, Alex, because I just kind of went back to A-level English literature because I remember studying the Gothic novel, and it was all about kind of repressed desires and them manifesting as ghosts, specifically Wuthering Heights, with the ghost of Cathy haunting Heathcliff. And I just remember the quote when he says, Cathy, you are more myself than I am. Or is it the other way around? I can't remember. Maybe it's Heathcliff, you're more myself than I am. But it's that kind of, the doubling. I really liked when Jonathan, in your presentation, when you were speaking about that kind of that double, and there's that same kind of the thematics of the doubling between those two protagonists. But, you know, Heathcliff, or Cathy's ghost is, you know, the ghost of those kinds of repressed desires that kind of keep haunting him. And again, you have the mad woman in the attic with Jane Eyre, and that sort of speaking about, you know, insanity and such. Yeah. Just I remember the branch knocking on the window in the Wuthering Heights, and it's the first place that the ghost took me. I think it's quite a big, actually, I went on a tour of Hampton Court over Christmas, and it seemed like I had a tour and someone speaking about, you know, the corridors, and it seemed like every corridor of Hampton Court was somehow haunted with, you know, either Anne Boleyn or I can't remember the name, was it Catherine Parr, the young lover, the young queen, she was like 18, the one that was beheaded and pleaded for her life, and, you know, people claim that they heard her screaming down the corridor. She was begging the king for mercy and forgiveness. So I just, when I think about those kinds of hauntings, it's always relating to like the kind of the feminine as well. It kind of seems to have that subjectivity, or perhaps kind of there's a kind of helplessness as well in that, and almost in that kind of ghostly form, they seem to say more than they can in their living.
I think it's interesting, I mean, the start where it's the Hamlet, the time is out of joint. So to do with the inability to represent time, the time which is striated or doesn't fold back into itself. It's on the loose. So disturbed time. You wonder what's Gaza's going to be like. would be potentially one of the most haunted places on earth. I mean, it's also strange how early photography was taken up by ghost or spirit photography, and the very notion of photography being ghostly, but also the impossibility of photographing ghosts. They often, like a sound trace, or they don't take on a visual form.
But I often wonder when we look at those photographs from those early photographers, and especially when you pair them with in relation to that Arcades project, whether it's also a moment where photographers are starting to learn how to process image and capture image. And so then there's mistakes in exposure and things are sort of disappearing, or they weren't, the exposure was too long, so they've walked off, or I don't know. So I often think there's been a lot of happy accidents then that also promote the idea of this ghostly apparition in the image that not necessarily have been there, but it starts to activate the imagination to think about the possibility of capturing a spirit or capturing an essence of something or someone.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting in the presentation, Jonathan, that you included the Francesca Woodman photographs, because it's almost kind of revisiting that. And I guess it was almost kind of psychoanalytically, an experience, just seeing that she the images saw herself almost better than she did, or the camera lens kind of saw her as a kind of apparition. And I know that a lot of it was about, I was actually looking through a catalogue of her work not long ago, and she spoke about why she used herself as a model. And I like this, she's just said, oh, well, I'm always available. It's such a strange, within the context of kind of ghostliness and apparition, it's just, it's that your own presence or your own self or your own body, and that kind of that othering of the self that's possible with the photographic lens, that you might not see yourself. So yeah, I really like that kind of definition of spectrality that you're speaking about, and again the doubling.
Did she?
She committed suicide in her 20s. So she was still in her 20s.
So she's really playing with this notion, isn't she, before she commits suicide, this notion of ghosting and this notion of passing across.
Yeah. And just bouncing around in rooms, and she's like just kind of floating in these spaces. And there was a series of works, photographs that she took in a natural history museum, and just kind of this, almost like this apparition amongst the vitrines. It's really strange kind of thinking about that, because that wasn't what she was so alive when I was reading the catalogue. So it was really interesting how it was kind of recontextualized. Those images were recontextualized, this evening in the course of this discussion. And there was something almost kind of prophetic in those images. Yeah.
something
Yeah.
interesting. Something interesting about. I have really been listening. It's just I'm going to mention Edgar Allan Poe again. I've been thinking as well. He kind of had quite a sort of, well, he died very young, and he had various kind of addictions and was kind of penniless. And his death is very mysterious. He was found, I actually forget the details slightly, but he was possibly stabbed or he was drowned, and he was dressed in completely different clothing to his own clothing, and had someone else's identification on him, and he had previously had a beard, and it was shaved, and his hair was cut short, and all of this kind of stuff. And the sort of theory about the circumstance of his death is that during sort of late 19th century US politics, arguably resonances with today, there was, well, or not, there was sort of systematic processes for fraudulently winning elections. And one of these processes was to buy votes. And the way you would do this would be to pay a penniless individual such as Edgar Allan Poe to pretend to be numerous different people, and then to go back to the same voting booth or wherever it might be, the voting station, and sort of you'd pay someone for voting 30 times or 50 times, and they would have to pretend to be a completely different person every time. And it's thought that he was doing this in order to earn money, and a rival, whatever it might be, mayoral candidate or something, their sort of gang of essentially gangsters murdered him in order to kind of, as part of the sort of battle of rigging an election. I think it was in Pittsburgh. I might be wrong. But that then sort of made me think about another really remarkable Russian writer called Nikolai Gogol, who was writing from around the sort of 1780s to sort of 1820, and then he burnt the manuscript of the third book of his masterpiece, and then took his own life. But this masterpiece, for which we have the first book and part of the second book, which was kind of rescued from the ashes, is fittingly called Dead Souls. And it's a kind of very curious satire about Russian provincial life, sort of around 1800. And the protagonist works out that you can get a state payout for every soul that you own, as in serf, as in essentially slave within the feudal system in Russia. They were called souls. And he works out that because of a time delay in when the state processes the death certificates of these souls, he could buy the sort of almost like ownership certificates of souls that had died from Russian landowners who all thought he was insane for wanting to buy the serfdom of a dead person. And he would go around, this is the protagonist of this story, Dead Souls, would go around these huge estates in Russia and would buy hundreds of dead souls, and would then kind of cash them in with the local kind of government, who hadn't yet processed the deaths of these dead souls, who were giving a sort of some kind of benefit grant to support your souls, though his were dead. So he had this extraordinary kind of money-making scheme, and it's a sort of satire on the whole absurdity of the bureaucracy of the feudal Russian system, and different kind of individual and characters are sort of parodied within that context. But there's something kind of interesting in that book about the kind of capitalization, I suppose, of the elsewhere. And I don't know, I was kind of just led from thinking about that to wondering about yeah, how that relates to, I don't know, sort of, for example, the kind of trading, buying and selling of back catalogues of dead artists, or the kind of, I mean, maybe this is just an obvious point, but the fact that kind of many of the artists that we are looking at in these presentations, often were not very wealthy, did not make money during their lifetime, but there's a kind of uplift. When we were looking around some galleries on Friday, for a brief period, I think we were talking about Lycia Clark, who has a show on at the Whitechapel at the moment. And Jonathan was saying that she's now very much, her sort of star is in the ascendancy. And I asked, when she died, and it was, I think, about 25 years ago, Jonathan replied. And I sort of think that there's something about death which kind of enhances the capital of some artists. And so I was just, I don't know, curious about what people thought about the elsewhere as a realm for capitalist kind of expansion and sort of control and exploitation, because we don't necessarily think, at least within the theory of these presentations, as the elsewhere as a sort of accessible place within that context. But could it be somewhere that could be the kind of the frontier of capitalism?
Alex, would you like us to pass over and then you could become our agent, so you could actually become our dealer?
Yeah, I mean, that could turn into a very kind of dark kind of murder mystery where every week one of us doesn't turn up. And we have to sort of, it's like a twist on Traitors or something. We have to work out who the dealer is.
Yeah, and sort of time is out of joint, so we sort of rapidly age and for on the screen, or I don't know, we could really play with this notion. I really like this notion of this sort of capitalist space that is beyond our, when we die, our death date. I think we should really maximize it. It's a really interesting idea.
I think many years ago I read Ben Elton's story of a TV show, reality show, and one of the contestants died on the scene. Of course, the reality show viewing rate shoot up, but actually it was planned by the producer to boost the rating. That's, of course, it's the story, but I guess we have that what if scenarios. And recently I watched a K-drama, it's a comedy, thriller, and it involves a painter, and a lot of his work is actually done by his son, the name of the father, and then somehow father suicide or accidentally died. Anyway, family continued to produce artwork using the dead father's name to make more money, that sort of scheme. Is there actual cases in art world or literary world, actually, that the death was fake to boost capital intake?
I wonder though, I mean, I know an artist, Scottish artist, who for the last, I think it's probably the last 40 years, he changes his identity every 10 years. And he never ever creates work. He literally changes everything. He changes his clothes, his attitude. He drops all of the people that he knew at that time, and he kind of vanishes and turns into someone else. And I wonder if that's kind of like a bit like what you're saying, Alex. He's except I don't know that he's capitalizing on it, but yeah, he's sort of inventing the death of himself. But he hasn't actually died yet, and not that many people have put all the clues together.
Well, he has died. He's died multiple times, but
yeah.
Lee Krasner continued to produce Pollux after he died, supposedly. Do you thought didn't make much money for me when he was living, so he's very well going to make money for me when he's.
That actually, I just remembered. I think it's probably similar in India as well. In Korea, we have a lot more of reincarnation. We believe more of reincarnation than living in a world of death or staying as a ghost. So what Abigail just told me about person who reinventing himself, herself, every 10 years, etc. We might have more stories or belief on people come back to afterlife, another life, different form, sort of thing. More in literature or shows in that sense. Is it from Hinduism? I think so. Hinduism, sort of thing.
The reincarnation. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, reincarnation is very much in our religion. Yeah, and culture also, in fact. Yeah. So even in Buddhism, if you see that it is like you come back in a different body or a different, being
And
as such. In Buddhism also.
Yeah, the teaching of Buddhism is basically you can get out of this
circle. Yeah, but
once
something
you get
similar
enlightened.
is in Hinduism also. Like that is the aim of the people, like to come out of it, like never be born again, but again. Yeah, but it's interesting how it empowers, even if it's a ghost, like even if it's story or not or whatever, the ghost has more agency, ghost has more power. It's interesting, like similarly as you say, the person has more power, like he sells more or he earns more after he's dead. Like it's interesting the similarities that, yeah.
I really like the in your presentation, Jonathan, this kind of idea of wavering, this wavering of the imagination and Schelling, Schelling saying about what do we say? Wavering is an essential feature of identity.
Mm-hmm.
I really like. I mean, it kind of conjures up ideas of other things surfacing within you. And I can't help thinking about, that our ancestors are, that things will surface within us, just like in cultural, in mythology and in how, myths appear within cultures. They surface, they don't, you don't make them up. And there's something about that sort of, the shimmering effect. I don't know, it got me really sort of thinking about dissipation, gathering up and dissipation and stuff appearing within the memory, within experience, within culture, and within society. It's like lots of fragments of things gathering together. I thought that was really interesting. I suppose it kind of links to the shadowing, this idea. I don't know if you realize, it's like almost becomes metaphorically caught between day and night, dusk and dawn, these sort of in-between spaces. What's causing the shadowing? In the day, it's blocking the light, and at night, it is it is the darkness, the silhouettes. Yeah, just fascinating.
I like that thing about the three technologies of early modernity, of the introduction of psychoanalysis, cinema, and the X-ray machine as three technologies of otherness that become emblematic of the shift into modernity, of the the portrayal of what was formerly invisible or beyond representation. So psychoanalysis is uncovering the repressed, cinema, the movement image, the X-ray is the inside of the body. It makes modernity into a dark affair. Are there any more questions or thoughts?